Hey friends, and welcome back to the Untold story, where history whispers and forgotten lives come gently back to life. Tonight, you're not just learning about the Roman Empire, you're living it. One echoing footstep along marble halls, one cautious glance over a guarded shoulder, one breath drawn in the shadow of the emperor's crown. But before we slip through the guarded gates of power, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy slow, immersive journeys through the world as it once was. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. It always amazes me to see how many of us are drawn together by the quiet hum of curiosity, across time zones and continents. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a soft fan for that steady background lull. Let your eyes get heavy and your mind go still. Our journey through the forgotten rhythms behind the Roman emperor's crown begins now. The marble floors of the Palatine Hill Palace glistened in the faint light of the dawn, their polished surfaces catching the pink and gold of a sun just beginning to rise above the rooftops of Rome. Outside, the city still murmured in its sleep. The Forum lay in a strange quiet, its columns casting long, ghostly shadows across the flagstones. The streets were mostly empty except for the occasional figure, a baker hurrying to his oven, a slave hauling amphorae of water, a patrol of Praetorian guards whose boots clicked rhythmically against the stones. Inside the palace, the silence was of another kind. It was not the stillness of peace, but the hush of watchfulness, as though the very walls held their breath. Every servant moved lightly, glancing over their shoulders, listening for sounds from corridors they did not dare to enter without permission. Somewhere beyond these marble halls, the emperor slept, or at least, that was what they hoped. No one ever truly knew when he slept, nor how lightly. The crown itself rested not on his head, but on a pedestal in the private audience chamber, a circlet of beaten gold, studded with gems that glowed like drops of frozen fire. To the common eye, it was the pinnacle of imperial grandeur, a symbol of divine authority. But to those who lived in the palace, the crown was something else entirely, a silent reminder of the blood that had been spilled to place it there, and the blood that would one day be spilled to take it away. The young scribe Lucius knew this better than most. He had been in the palace for only 2 years, yet he had already seen 3 men vanish without a trace after whispering the wrong words in the wrong corridors. His task each morning was simple: copy the records of the emperor's decrees, seal them, and deliver them to the Senate's messenger. But in Rome, even the simplest duties had shadows. Sometimes a decree was sealed before Lucius had even read it. Sometimes he was told to burn the wax tablets entirely, and to forget he had ever seen them. This morning, however, was different. A summons had come for him before dawn, not to the scribal chamber, but to the emperor's private quarters. No reason given, only a single line on a piece of vellum: bring your hands, your ink, and your silence. Lucius walked the length of the corridor toward the imperial doors, feeling the coolness of the marble seep through the soles of his sandals. The Praetorians standing guard at the entrance did not speak. They only studied him with the still, cold eyes of men who had long ago stopped seeing faces as anything more than flesh to be cut down if necessary. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of incense and something darker, myrrh, perhaps, or the faint tang of wine spilled and left to dry on the table. The emperor was awake, seated on a couch draped in crimson cloth, the flicker of oil lamps painting restless shadows across his face. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes, dark and steady, held the weight of a man who had learned to see through every mask. "Lucius," he said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to draw the younger man fully to attention. "Today you will write not for the Senate, nor for the archives. Today, you will write for me. And you will write the truth." The truth. In the palace, that was a dangerous word. The emperor gestured toward a small table beside him. On it lay a scroll half unrolled, its papyrus fibers already fraying at the edges, as though it had been handled many times. Lucius could see the inked lines, faint but legible, and the seal at the bottom, broken. Whoever had read this had already defied the rules. "You will copy this," the emperor continued, "and you will make one copy only. When you are done, you will burn the original, and you will never speak of it again. Not to your friends, not to your family, not even to yourself in the privacy of your thoughts. The words you are about to copy are the kind that can end empires." Lucius swallowed. His hands itched to unroll the scroll further, to see what secrets it contained, but he forced himself to remain still. In Rome, curiosity could kill more surely than a sword. The emperor leaned back, his gaze shifting to the window where the first true rays of sunlight now touched the city. "You think the crown is gold, Lucius? It is not. It is iron. and it grows heavier with every year it rests on a man's head. You will see, as I have, that behind the crown there is nothing but shadows, and the shadows are alive." The words lingered in the air like the scent of incense, curling into the corners of the room. Lucius picked up his reed pen, dipped it in the ink, and began to copy. The first lines were names he recognized from the Senate, from the army, from whispers in the marketplace. Names of men who had once stood in the emperor's presence and now, apparently, stood in his way. As the list grew, so did Lucius's unease. Some names were marked with small symbols, others with short notes in a hand he did not recognize. There were words like betrayer, debtor, and unreliable. And then there were darker words: traitor, poisoner, conspirator. Somewhere deep in the palace, a bell rang softly. It was the signal for the morning meal, yet the sound felt strangely distant. Lucius kept writing, his pulse matching the steady scratch of the pen. He was aware, dimly, that the emperor was watching him the entire time, as though measuring his every breath. When the final name was copied, the emperor rose. He took the original scroll in both hands, held it for a moment as though weighing its significance, and then dropped it into the brazier. The flames caught quickly, the papyrus curling inward as black ash bloomed outward. "Now," the emperor said, turning back to Lucius, "you have something in your mind that you cannot share, and you will carry it until your last breath. That is the true weight of the crown, not the gold, not the jewels, but the secrets. And if those secrets ever leave your lips, remember this: the crown may be mine, but the sword is never far away." Lucius bowed, his mouth dry. He understood now why the corridors of the palace were so quiet in the morning, not because the world was still waking, but because here, behind the emperor's crown, silence was the first and last law. The morning light had spread further now, spilling across the Palatine Hill in pale gold, but inside the palace, the shadows still ruled. Lucius left the emperor's private chamber with the coppered scroll clutched in his satchel, its weight somehow greater than the thin roll of papyrus should allow. Every step he took felt measured, deliberate, because in this place, speed drew eyes, and eyes could mean questions, and questions could be fatal. The corridors twisted like the alleys of the Subura, each turn revealing another guarded door, another silent figure standing too still to be at ease. He passed a young maid carrying a tray of figs, her eyes fixed on the ground, an old eunuch shuffling along with a small bronze key in his palm, its surface polished by decades of turning in secret locks. None of them looked directly at him. Here, glances were currency, spent only when absolutely necessary. Lucius's route took him past the peristyle garden, where columns framed a courtyard of sculpted laurel and rose bushes pruned into geometric perfection. The faint trickle of a fountain was the only sound. Seated beside it, half hidden by the foliage, was Julia, one of the Empress's ladies-in-waiting. Her robe was the pale green of spring, her hair pinned with a single pearl, understated yet carefully chosen. She was speaking in a low voice to a man whose back was to Lucius, his cloak trimmed in the purple stripe that marked a senator. Lucius didn't pause, but he heard a word carried on the air before he passed beyond earshot: succession. He kept walking. The Senate's messenger was waiting for him in the scribal chamber, drumming his fingers on the table. He was a tall man, lean, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No decree today?" he asked. Lucius shook his head. "None that concerned the Senate." It was a careful answer. True enough, if you ignored the one that could dismantle half of Rome's political web. The messenger's gaze lingered a moment too long, then he shrugged and left. When the door closed, Lucius let out a slow breath. He stored the scroll in the hidden compartment beneath his desk, one of several carved into the wood long before he'd been assigned here, and placed a plain wax tablet on top. To anyone who entered, it would seem he had nothing to hide. But in the palace, nothing stayed hidden forever. By midday, the sun had risen high, sending shafts of light slanting through the clerestory windows. The emperor was holding a private council in the triclinium, a smaller dining room lined with frescoes of Neptune's chariot and the sea's restless waves. Around the table sat men who commanded armies, controlled treasuries, and whispered to the people in the markets. There was Marcus Varus, the general with scars deep enough to catch shadow, whose loyalty was spoken of with equal parts admiration and suspicion. Beside him, Gaius Petronius, the governor of Sicily, whose ships brought grain to feed the capital, when it suited him. And across from them, in the seat closest to the emperor, sat Flavia, the empress herself, draped in gold-threaded silk that caught every glimmer of light. Lucius, summoned to serve wine, moved quietly between them, listening without seeming to listen. The talk began with the usual matters: border skirmishes in the east, trade routes along the Nile, but soon shifted, as it always did, to matters that would never appear in the Senate's official record. The Germanic tribes are restless, Varus was saying, his deep voice carrying an edge. They probe the border more boldly each season. If they sense weakness. They sense nothing we do not let them, Flavia interrupted smoothly, her eyes flicking toward the Emperor. But weakness is not always shown on the battlefield, is it? A pause. The room seemed to shrink. The Emperor said nothing, only traced a finger along the rim of his goblet. Petronius leaned forward. The Senate debates matters of loyalty even now. Too many families have grown fat on imperial favor. Some forget where that favor comes from. Lucius poured another measure of wine into the Emperor's cup. As he straightened, he caught Flavia watching him, not idly, but with a sharpness that made his skin prickle. It was the look of someone who measured others the way a jeweler measures gold, weighing worth against risk. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered like a scent in the air. Lucius knew enough to understand that today's words, spoken over a table heavy with food and drink, would become tomorrow's orders whispered in darkened corridors. Later, as the council broke apart, the Emperor rose and crossed the room to Lucius. He spoke softly, almost as if to himself. "Do you know why a crown has no clasp, Lucius?" Lucius hesitated. "No, my lord." "Because once it is on your head," the Emperor said, his gaze distant, "you cannot take it off without blood." He walked away before Lucius could reply. That night, long after the lamps had been lit and the corridors quieted, Lucius returned to the scribal chamber. He unsealed the compartment and unrolled the scroll again, reading by the faint glow of a single oil lamp. His eyes moved down the list of names until he reached one that made his breath catch. It was not a senator or a general, not a merchant or a foreign envoy. It was a name he knew intimately, one he had copied 100 times in routine documents. It was the name of Flavia, the Empress. He stared at it until the lamp began to gutter, the shadows deepening around him. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed softly. The sound was small, almost lost in the stillness, but Lucius felt it like a warning. In the palace, nothing was ever truly quiet. The Emperor's inner circle, power, loyalty, and betrayal. The palace lived by its own slow rhythm, a heartbeat measured in footfalls and the soft scrape of a stylus across wax. Within it, a handful of people held a weight that eclipsed the empire's many provinces, each one a conduit through which decisions, favors, fears, and poison could pass. They moved through the corridors with the confidence of those who had long ago learned that influence was a kind of breathing, necessary, invisible, and easily choked. Among them, the Emperor's closest companions were a study in contrasts. There was Marcus Varus, the general whose face was a map of battles, whose right cheek bore a long pale seam from a blade that had once sawed his throat. He walked with a slight hitch, his left shoulder drawn in from the scar, and when he laughed it sounded like armor against stone. He loved the simple things, the clatter of armor being polished, the smell of wet earth after march. Yet beneath the soldier's comforts lay a hunger, an appetite not just for glory but for the certainty that his name would be carved in histories not written by a rival hand. There was Gaius Petronius, who kept the grain ships moving and the city fed. He dressed like a man who had never missed a sunrise, robes immaculately folded, hair brushed just so. He had a way of speaking that flattened argument into assent. Men who owed him favor seldom forgot. Petronius's face was always a careful neutrality, like a ledger balanced to the last coin, kindness recorded as credit, threat as an unpaid debit. Where Varus was force, Petronius was the cunning distribution that made force sustainable. Then there was Flavia. The palace whispered her name as one might whisper a warning, beautiful, patient, deadly. She moved as if light pursued her and men followed. She spoke as if each word were a coin of such fine alloy that none could afford to spend it carelessly. Her silk robes were never accidental. Each fold concealed meaning, alliances, promises. She had found in marriage to the Emperor not merely security, but the most intricate game of influence, and had learned to play it like a musician coaxing a lyre. When she smiled at a guest, that smile was both a coronation and an inventory. Opposite these high-visibility figures stood the less noticed agents of palace power, freedmen who ran day-to-day operations, eunuchs who held sets of keys, scribes whose hands shaped the stories that would become precedent. They were the threads through which a court's tapestry could be ripped quietly. A freedman could be purchased for a small favor. A eunuch could be moved by a rumor folded into his ear while he trimmed a lamp. A scribe could alter a line that would change the fate of provinces. Lucius belonged to this last, and the intimacy of ink and papyrus had made him dangerous without his desiring it. Loyalty in the emperor's circle was never simple. It was bargaining with shadows. Men professed devotion not always because they believed, but because devotion was sometimes the currency of survival. A general might swear fealty to save his legion. A senator might nod agreement to ensure the preservation of a family estate. Even love could be transactional, subject to recalculation if the sum of danger outgrew the sum of comfort. There were, too, the instruments of enforcement, the Praetorian prefect and his captains, men whose faces the populace rarely saw but whose judgment could decide kingship. They were supposed to be the imperial shield, yet history's ledger showed them as kingmakers on more than one occasion. A glance from the prefect could open gates or close them forever. He kept his men disciplined not only by pay but by a cultivated taste for the spoils that came with being close to power. They were the yellow jackets of the palace, dull and buzzing, waiting for the scent of blood. Information was the most precious commodity. Messengers were screened, letters were sealed and waxed twice, thrice, and sometimes burnt after reading. Yet information seeped as all liquids do, finding cracks where it could. A gossiping cupbearer overheard a whispered counsel. A slave who wiped the brow of a general might know the names of the men he feared. So the emperor's circle set up redundancies, confidants for confidants, tests of allegiance disguised as favors, small humiliations administered publicly to see who would protest. At first, these measures had been protocols, practicalities to maintain order. Over time, however, they became instruments wielded to fashion power, to prune potential rivals, to ensure that no one's roots grew too deep. An emperor might prefer to spare a loyal man's life and instead strip him of dignity, send him to a provincial governorship far from the capital. A man's removal could be achieved quietly, leaving no corpse on the Palatine steps, only the rumor of an honorable reassignment. Yet there were darker arts as well. The poisoners of the empire were not always the hired assassins of shadowy guilds. Sometimes they were apothecaries beloved of the court, men who blended remedies with a scientist's care and a trader's intent. Medicine could be a knife without a handle. A physician trusted to ease a fever could, through a subtle compound, tilt a man's heart toward ruin. Physicians were kept close, then watched, their loyalty bought with golden plates or with houses across the Tiber. Religion and superstition threaded the circle's politics too. Haruspices and astrologers were summoned under the pretense of ritual. Fortune-tellers folded their prophecies into banquets, and before a campaign a general might want his luck read in entrails. The emperor could use a prophecy to justify action, and a carefully leaked horoscope could be the seed of paranoia. If the heavens suggested a successor, factions would align as if against an invisible general. In times of uncertainty, faith often became a weapon, sacraments rearranged to fit a political will. Lucius, who had once thought his life simple, ink, wax, the sedate procession of decrees, now saw how every document could be a fissure or a foundation. The scroll he had copied sat inside him like a pebble in a shoe, small but constant. He found himself watching faces differently, noting how Flavia's eyes rested on the emperor's hands, how Varus's jaw clenched when Petronius spoke of grain, how the prefect's laughter was always a beat too late. Small observations turned into patterns, patterns into suspicions, and suspicions bred a nervousness that had no respite. One evening, as rain fretted the palace roof and the lamps blurred the room into a soft insistence of gold, the emperor summoned Varus to a private council. Lucius served the wine, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. He watched the exchange close enough to hear the hushed cadence of argument. Varus's voice was low, a rumble that might have been comfort, might have been threat. The emperor listened, the cup in his hand untouched. At a point, he stood and walked to the window that looked down over the city, fingers pressed to the glass as if feeling for something beyond sight. Power, the emperor said quietly when he turned back, is not merely the right to command, it is the ongoing exercise of convincing others that you ought to command. His words were not new to those who had learned in the streets that rule depended on consent. Yet the way he said them made the room feel thinner, as though he were peeling skin from bone. The aftermath of that night was subtle but inexorable. Orders traveled with new urgency. A retinue was reassigned from one province to another. Governors were politely advised to visit the capital to consult on matters of grain. A freedman who had shown too much independence found himself slipping into obscurity. His place at banquets was gradually taken. The web of influence tightened where it needed to, slackened where suspicion wanted it to. Rumors gather weight in a court like water on a low shelf. At first a bead, then a line, then a break. One rumor took root like a vine. Whispers that Flavia, whose calm rarely cracked, entertained voices in the night, that she had counsel not only from senators but from a foreign envoy with strange tastes, that her favor had become a market. The rumor reached Lucius as a shadow behind a joke, a phrase folded into a petition he once copied. He felt the scroll's names burn behind his ribs. The danger was not only for those named on the parchment. Danger radiated outward, to those who touched them, to those who moved their cups, to those who cleaned their sandals. Lucius understood that proximity could be poison. To be near a man who had been named was to risk the contagion of suspicion. He began to measure distances, not with steps, but with associations. He watched how Petronius lingered too long in corridors where Varus walked, how the prefect deferred when Flavia passed. And yet, even as the circle closed, alliances formed with astonishing speed. The very machinery that could destroy a man could also conjure him back to prominence. A well-timed curtain of charity, a festival for the games, a public gift of grain, could turn the tide of public sentiment faster than a spear. Image-making was as essential as blade work. A single triumph parade, a single generous act, could wash away a rumor as rain washes dust from a mosaic. In the heart of such dynamics, lucidity was rare. Men told themselves stories to survive, narratives that simplified the dizzying choices into something bearable. A loyalist convinced himself that his fidelity would be rewarded. A schemer convinced himself he acted for the empire. The emperor sometimes believed his own myths, that he ruled for the people, that his choices were pure. The palace required such illusions if it were to function. Without them, the fragile edifice of daily order might collapse into chaos. By the time the month's calends turned, the Palatine hummed with the tension of quiet preparation. Trains of messengers shuffled, lists were updated, and the emperor's face took on a hard, private composition, like a coin whose image you only see when you peer close. Lucius walked among it all, his secret scroll folded in the most secret of places, feeling the crown's weight press through silk and bone. He had become a vessel of knowledge he had not asked to carry, and that knowledge made him both small and monstrously important. Outside the palace, Rome went about its noisy business. Children chasing a hoop, a vendor haggling over olives, a poet reciting a line about the impermanence of glory. Inside, the same impermanence simmered into plans. At night, when the lamps guttered and the palace exhaled into sleep, Lucius, the silent architects of power, Rome's women behind the curtain. They were never the ones seated on the throne. Their faces did not appear on coins, nor were their speeches carved into marble. Yet, in the shaded halls of Rome's palaces, behind the silk curtains and within the perfumed chambers where only the most trusted could enter, these women shaped the empire as surely as any general or senator. Their weapons were subtler, words whispered at the right moment, letters carried in the folds of gowns, glances that could bind alliances or destroy reputations. And though the marble statues in the forum were almost entirely male, the silent architects of power were often female. The empire's most dangerous corridors were not always lined with soldiers. Sometimes they were draped in velvet, scented with incense, and echoing with the soft laughter of women who understood the game far better than the men who thought they played it. From the imperial mothers who guarded their sons' inheritance to the empresses whose public smiles masked private vendettas, each woman operated within an invisible web, one that wrapped itself around the emperor's crown. Consider Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus. To the Roman people, she was the model of dignity, the embodiment of virtue. But behind that image lay decades of careful maneuvering. She placed allies in key positions, eased rivals into retirement or into exile, and ensured that her stepson Tiberius ascended the throne. The records accuse her of poisonings, though such charges were as much a political weapon as any dagger. Still, the rumor was powerful. Livia had not merely been the emperor's wife, she had been the empire's quiet architect. Her calm presence at Augustus' side was less a show of loyalty than a demonstration of control. Other women, like Julia Doma, wife of Septimius Severus, wielded influence through intellect. Born in Syria, she was famed for her learning and gathered philosophers, jurists, and poets around her. She turned the imperial court into a kind of salon, where ideas and policies intertwined. Her sons, Caracalla and Geta, would inherit the empire, but their mother's hand was visible in the decisions they made, and in the bloody rivalries that defined their reigns. When those sons turned against each other, Julia's position became impossible, yet even then, she retained a dignity that kept her close to power until the end. It would be wrong to think all influence was confined to the empresses. Mistresses could shape history, too. A beautiful slave girl elevated to the emperor's bed might carry the requests of generals, the complaints of senators, or the secrets of conspirators. If she was clever, she could become a gatekeeper, controlling not just the emperor's pleasure, but his attention. Some used that position to enrich themselves or their families. Others used it to exact quiet revenge against those who had once scorned them. In the dim light of the women's quarters, rivalries flared. Not all women pulled in the same direction. Some worked actively against each other, each trying to secure her own influence over the man who wore the crown. Gifts of rare perfume or exotic silks could be a way of winning favor, or of declaring open challenge. A simple smile at a banquet could signal support for a faction, while an absent greeting could hint at the start of a political war. The most skillful among them learned how to disappear into the background when necessary, to let others believe they were powerless. This invisibility was their shield. A woman seen as harmless could move freely, gather information, and pass it to those she favored. When the moment came, she could strike, not with a blade, but with a word, a look, or a suggestion made in the emperor's ear at precisely the right time. Even those outside the palace played their part. Wealthy matrons in the city's elite houses hosted gatherings where senators and military leaders relaxed their guard. These women listened, remembered, and later repeated the right words to the right people. They were not spies in the traditional sense, but they were conduits of influence, their homes serving as unofficial branches of the imperial court. Sometimes, the power of these women was most visible in the aftermath of tragedy. An emperor's death often unleashed chaos, factions scrambling for dominance, armies declaring loyalty to one claimant or another. In such moments, women stepped forward as mediators, brokers, or even kingmakers. They negotiated between generals, promised support to potential heirs, and distributed wealth to secure alliances. Their efforts were often erased from the official accounts, replaced by the image of men in armor deciding Rome's fate. But the truth was that many of those decisions were made in candlelit rooms, by women whose names never appeared in the records. One can almost picture it, the marble corridors echoing softly at night, a lone figure moving quickly beneath the frescoed ceilings. In her hand, a sealed scroll. In her mind, a plan that could alter the empire's future. The guard at the door steps aside. He knows better than to interfere. She passes through, vanishing into the private chambers where history will take a quiet, decisive turn. No one will sing of her in the streets, no statue will bear her likeness, yet a shadow will fall over the empire for decades to come. The crown on the emperor's head was never his alone. It was balanced by 1,000 unseen hands, some of them adorned with gold rings, others calloused from work, but all equally capable of shaping the destiny of Rome. The women behind the curtain understood this better than anyone. They played the long game, knowing that in the dangerous theater of empire, survival and influence were often the same thing. And so they moved silently, gracefully, ensuring that, no matter who wore the laurel, the empire's true heartbeat remained in their keeping. The machinery of fear, spies, informants, and secret trials. In the hush between one lamp and the next, Rome kept a second, quieter court that most citizens never saw. It did not sit in the marble forum or on the public steps where magistrates proclaimed their laws. It convened in the folded shadows of private chambers, in the back rooms of taverns, along the narrow alleys where a whispered name could travel like a breeze through dry straw. It was a machinery made not of bronze gears and pulleys but of small hands, furtive glances, and the precise rhythm of rumor. And at its center was a single instrument more effective than any sword: fear. This machinery had many parts, each honed to catch and convert information. It began with those closest to the emperor's daily life, cupbearers who watched the trembling of a hand as one raised a goblet, bedchamber attendants who learned nocturnal confidences, physicians who felt pulses and read the hesitant pauses in speech. A slave who polished a breastplate or smoothed an emperor's cloak could, with a single evening's report, change a man's future. Their testimonies were small in themselves but combined into weighty truth. A harmless joke overheard in a corridor became, in time, an allegation. A private quarrel at a banquet was retold with emphasis, and emphasis grows teeth when repeated. Beyond the household, a vast net of informants pulled in whispers from the city and provinces. Merchants traveling with their ledgers brought back more than grain prices. They returned with gossip about governors who lingered too long on estate inspections or recruits who refused orders. Ship captains, more interested in safe passage than politics, might casually note a convoy diverted or a letter arriving in a port. Local magistrates, eager for favor, would sometimes act as the emperor's ears in the provinces, forwarding rumors they believed would please those above them. Even the games were listened to. A shouting crowd, a satirical line of a poet, or the cheers for a favored general could be recorded and passed along as signs of unrest. The informers themselves were a diverse lot. Some were men and women desperate for coin or patronage, trading secrets like any other commodity. Others were professional delators, practitioners of accusation who understood how to craft an allegation so it would flourish in the imperial mind. A delator could frame a rival by finding a few ambiguous facts and dressing them in a tale of disloyalty. Sometimes ambition drove them, sometimes revenge. The reward was not always immediate money. Often it came as land confiscated from the accused, as a place at a banquet, as the quiet favor of a powerful man. The system was perverse. By making accusation profitable, it made accusation common. Feeding this system was the art of translation, taking rumor and shaping it into charge. A private argument became evidence of conspiracy. A misread letter was transformed into a coded plot. In the right hands, even a mistake could appear intentional. The very treacherousness of language made it fertile ground for accusation. The palace received dossiers assembled not unlike mosaicists set tiny stones, each fleck trivial, but the image they formed might be damning. Names, dates, times, the color of a robe, the attendance at a supper, each detail could be sodded to the next until a narrative of guilt crystallized. When the machinery took notice, the next stage unfolded with a grim choreography. An order would travel quietly, a prefect consulted in the dark, a notary summoned to create a record that might never see the light of day, an emissary told to fetch a man under courteous pretense. Arrests were rarely public spectacles. They were knocks in the night, a slight cough outside a door, the sharp pressure of a hand on the shoulder of someone still in bed. Sometimes men were removed to the Tullianum or other custody places, sometimes to a private house figure where the emperor's will could be executed without the messy business of a public hearing. The secrecy was strategic. The less the people saw, the more their imagination filled the blanks, and imagination is a powerful tool for ordering obedience. Trials, when they occurred, were another instrument in this apparatus. There were formal trials in the Senatus, for those deemed suitable to be seen dying in public, but often the most dangerous proceedings were those that never reached the formal space. The emperor could call a private hearing, a summary inquiry in which the accused faced a handful of men who held both pen and sword. Evidence for such trials could be scant. Confessions, sometimes obtained through persuasion, were given weight. The Roman laws forms could be bent. An accusation of treachery, maiestas, could be applied broadly, and the charge itself carried moral weight before any proof was introduced. In many cases, the court's goal was not to discover truth but to manage danger, to silence a potential rival, to secure property, or to teach others the consequences of misstep. There were methods used to extract confession that did not always leave marks for the world to see. Interrogation in the privacy of palace walls could be a conversation prolonged until the subject's resolve wore thin. It could be an implied threat, we would be shocked to discover, that suggested the scale of power behind the quiet voice. Torture, where applied, left scars and sometimes death, but even the threat of exposure could be sufficient. Families were leveraged, reputations held over heads like a delicate, menacing weight. A man might be offered death with honor or exile with his possessions stripped, choices that bent many wills. The result was often the same, a confession or a silence that functioned like a confession, and a laws machinery that turned the personal into the public. The terror produced by the machinery extended far beyond the person taken. It was contagious. Neighbors spoke less openly. Suppers where the wine flowed became exercises in caution. Men and women rewrote their greetings, adding a sentence of loyalty where once there had been none. Children learned early to watch which names produced frowns in adults. Patron-client relationships, those networks of reciprocal favors that kept Roman social life moving, became cautious transactions. Patrons asked fewer blunt questions. Clients praised earlier, flatter longer. The culture of fear inserted itself into daily language. Phrases were clipped, metaphors avoided, and jokes that could be twisted into seditious meaning were left unsaid. The machinery thrived in that silence. At the same time, the machinery needed performance. Power required the spectacle of enforcement to make its threat credible. Late-night arrests required a knowing populace to spread the moral. Confiscation served as both punishment and replenishment of imperial coffers. Public displays, a dramatic trial, a forced suicide recited in state historiography, served as objects' lessons. These are the consequences of stepping too far. The crown used visibility and invisibility in tandem. Visible punishment for a few, invisible processes for many. In that way, the emperor crafted a landscape where choices were often not between right and wrong, but between safety and danger. The users of this machinery were not a monolith. Some emperors used it as a necessary evil. an ugly but useful administrative tool to maintain order in a sprawling world. Others wielded it as an end in itself, a means of molding the empire to personal temperament. The prefect of the Praetorian Guard could be both gatekeeper and weapon, an enforcer of the emperor's will and sometimes a player with his own ambitions. Ambitious prefects understood the value of rumor, of striking alliances with delators, of supplying the emperor with indictments that salted their own path to favor. The result was a feedback loop. Those who managed the machinery could manipulate it to increase their own reach, and in good times, those gains were absorbed into the larger structure of power. There were moral costs beyond the immediate victims. The empire slowly learned to internalize suspicion. Civic virtues, openness, frank debate in the Senate, the casual trust between man and neighbor, withered as safety demanded caution. Talent was sometimes smeared as risk. Capable men withdrew from prominence to avoid the gaze of the machinery. Administration became risk-averse, making incremental governance over bold reform. In private, thoughtful men feared to speak their minds lest their words be turned into evidence against them or their children. This slow corrosion reshaped Rome as much as any external war. Yet fear was not the only result. The machinery also created unexpected solidarities. Families of the accused banded together, patrons sheltered clients, and sometimes the very injustice of a process united those who would otherwise remain strangers. A poet's lament might gather the sympathies of an audience that would never confront a prefect, but would remember a humiliation. In quieter, less convenient ways, resistance took shape, through coded letters, through the preservation of banned books, through the careful guarding of names and dates in private records kept from the eyes of the inquisitors. These traces of dissent were small, but they were persistent. Over time, the machinery of fear became part of the crown itself. The weight of the laurel was augmented by the knowledge that power could remove men's names as quickly as it had given them. Emperors learned that ruling with terror alone was costly in legitimacy, yet the occasional scare kept too many ambitions tethered. The empire's balance, in this regard, was delicate. Too much secrecy and cruelty left governors in revolt. Too little allowed factions to assemble openly. So the machinery adjusted, less cruel in periods of stability, more ruthless when succession was uncertain or rebellions bred. For those who lived within it, the machinery shaped habits, not merely actions. One learned to answer questions with a cadence that sounded obliging but refused to betray sentiment. One learned to shift subjects like a practiced actor, to rehearse innocuous stories as proof of harmlessness. Some took to writing in codes, others to bribing messengers to misdirect gossip. The mind itself turned cautious. Memory became selective, not out of malice, but from the practical desire to protect others and self. In that climate, silence could be a form of mercy, an act of preservation for a child, a spouse, or a friend. And so the palace continued to breathe this labor of fear, a slow process of collection and transmission, accusation and judgment, the poisoned chalice, intrigue and assassination in the imperial court. By the time the lamps were lit and the last of the day's errands had been laid to rest, the palace changed its skin. The soundscape that filled the marble rooms during the day, footsteps on polished floors, vendors' distant cries, senators' hurried conversations, muted into a low, expectant hush. At night, the court preferred shadows. It trusted shade more than the harsh glare of public scrutiny. It was in that thin hour between feast and sleep that the most decisive things were done, and the most subtle weapons were used. Assassination at the highest level was rarely a blunt instrument. To remove an emperor was to invite a confusion that might spill the city into unrest. It could unsettle legions and spark provincial revolts. So the clever often chose methods that would obscure intention. Illness that came like a traveler and stayed like a guest, a sudden and inexplicable fever, a quiet decline that the physicians attributed to natural causes. Poison was the favored poetry of such deaths, not because it was quick, but because it left room for narrative. A chalice could be blamed on bad wine, a cough on damp air, and a fainting fit on too much wine or poor digestion. The craft was to make the killing appear ordinary. There were many craftspeople in that art. Behind the scenes stood apothecaries and physicians whose hands could prescribe a cure that was also a sentence. They mixed decoctions from roots and leaves, balanced powders whose doses shifted life's delicate balance. Some poisons worked quickly and left obvious symptoms. Others crept slowly through the body, eroding strength to the point where exhaustion looked like age. A cup of wine laced with aconite could cause a quick collapse. Small doses of a slow-acting toxin, blended over weeks, could produce a wasting that the most inexperienced court doctor might call a lingering fever. In the palace, loyalty and payment often determined the word a physician put to a corpse's lips. But poison was not the only art employed. The palace had other methods: staged accidents along treacherous stairways, favors turned into traps in bathhouses, the subtle orchestration of stress, sleep-deprived rulers as sloppy rulers, and a badly timed night ride could end with an unfortunate fall. There were knives that struck in the middle of a riot, blades that glinted then vanished in a crowd. There were conspirators who used the tools of intimacy, oils applied to a ring that transferred a toxin to the skin of a hand, a handkerchief dampened in a sedative, a sleeping draught that left a man vulnerable to a carefully arranged collapse. Each method required actors, kitchen boys, cupbearers, eunuchs, freedmen, people on whom trust had been built and who could be bought or threatened. Banquets were a favored stage because they were public enough to allow the perpetrator to appear innocent and intimate enough to permit a secret touch. A single goblet at a great dining table could be the hinge upon which history turned. The table's placement, the order of toasts, the attention given to one cup over another, these were all signals in a plotter's playbook. A cloak brushed against the wrong sleeve by accident, a servant's coin slipped into the hand of a kitchen boy, a favored cup handed by a smiling guest, the smallest gesture could be the pivot. The conspirators rehearsed their roles with the same diligence as actors: smiles, jokes, the timed raising of goblets, so that witnesses would remember only the pageant and not the mechanics behind it. Motives varied and stacked. Some conspirators sought glory, to place a son on the throne, to secure a line of succession congenial to their interests. Others sought to settle old scores: a steward robbed of inheritance, a general slighted in battle, a senator's family whose lands had been redistributed. Money and favor operated as obvious incentives, but other drives were subtler: fear for one's life if a particular memoir or decree were to be read aloud, shame over a private indiscretion, or the desire to prevent an emperor from pushing a policy that would impoverish an entire class. The motives turned petty grievances into capital offenses. The apparatus that enabled assassination required coordination across social strata. A plotter might begin with a well-placed rumor to test reaction, then seek out a kitchen servant who could be bribed to add a tincture to a condiment, or a cupbearer who could be persuaded, by gold or a threatened relative, to place a poisoned vessel where the emperor would be certain to drink. Sometimes the prefect of the guard was complicit, ensuring that certain doors would remain unlocked or that particular guards would be distracted. Often the plot needed a layer of plausible deniability: a merchant's wine shipment declared spoiled, a physician's diagnosis of sudden bowel disorder, a rumor of a southern summer fever that would explain coughing and aches across the capital. Plausibility was crucial. Once the deed began to take shape, the perpetrators turned to contingency. If an emperor fell sick in a palace chamber, certain people would seal off rooms, letters in the private desk would be burned, physicians would be called to produce the right diagnosis. Trusted friends might be led to believe that only the gods had willed it, easy consolations that stopped questions short. Other times, a public narrative was constructed to explain a death by invoking bad weather, a curse, or a long-standing illness. That narrative was fed to the public through favored poets, through panegyrists who delivered a flowery eulogy, through official notices that framed the loss in terms that protected the state from panic. Those who orchestrated assassinations could also engineer the aftermath for their benefit. Confiscation of an accused man's lands and the redistribution of his wealth to the emperor's favorites created both motive and reward. A successful plot might result in elevated ranks for conspirators, prefects who petitioned for honors, freedmen whose family names suddenly appeared in inscription. Sometimes the goal was not to seize the throne but to remake the court, remove a rival minister, replace a general with a pliant subordinate, or force a marriage pact. Power, in the palace, changed hands most often by removing obstacles rather than by conquest. But plots were risky, always, and often failed. A poisoned chalice might be spilled, a servant might choke and confess, a physician might detect an unusual compound and report it. When discovery occurred, the consequences were brutal. The machinery of the court turned on the conspirators: arrests in the middle of the night, dramatic public trials for those deemed expendable examples, and quiet, private executions for those whose families could buy silence. Sometimes the guilty were forced into honorable suicides to spare their family's shame. In other cases, entire households were stripped of status, and descendants lived in the shadow of confiscation for generations. The emperor himself, when suspecting poison, found his world narrowing. He learned to mistrust the hands that brought his food, the smiles that offered cups, the touch of a sleeve as someone brushed a shoulder. Sleep fled him. He sent trusted men ahead on journeys. He demanded the handwriting of recipes and inspected jars. In some reigns, emperors limited their meals to a small circle, ate only food prepared by sworn royal cooks, or drank from cups made and sealed under watch. Such precautions were never perfect. To isolate an emperor completely was impractical, and in seeking to secure himself, he might alienate many whose good opinion he still required. For those like Lucius, scribes and minor functionaries, the unfolding of an assassination did not always take the shape of a public drama. Lucius felt the shift in subtler ways. Orders changed with greater frequency. Some memos were couriered in secrecy and locked away. He watched as once common servants became furtive, as certain names dropped from lists and were replaced with others whose faces he had not seen. When an emperor fell ill, Lucius saw how the palace prioritized information. Urgent copies of decrees were written or withheld depending on the physician's note, and the emperor's closest aides met more often under the guise of private condolence than true governance. In those circles, truth became negotiable. Occasionally, the assassination would spur a purge that flowed far beyond the conspirators themselves. In the months after a palace murder, paranoia could breed a wave of preemptive strikes. Rivals arrested on the thinnest grounds, a rash of exiles, the culling of certain military commanders who might be tempted to take advantage of disorder. The crown's custodians might overreact, believing that a dramatic display of power would restore order. But such measures could also create new enemies and fuel cycles of revenge. What began as a secret removal could ripen into open factional violence. Religion and omen-making were woven into the response as well. Priests and augurs might be consulted to divine the god's will, and their pronouncements used to justify harsh reprisals. A prophecy of disfavor could be used to purge a senator who had invited the god's wrath. Conversely, an approving ritual might be staged to cleanse the palace and reassert the emperor's favor with heaven. These ceremonies served two functions. They offered the frightened populace a visible mechanism for restoring cosmic order, and they provided political cover for those who wished to eliminate rivals under the cloak of piety. The cultural cost of living under the threat of assassination stretched beyond immediate politics. Men and women in positions of influence learned to portray themselves as unthreatening, adopting modesty in dress or deferential rhetoric. Sons were advised to avoid public displays of ambition. Patrons coached clients to speak with less vigor in public. The very texture of elite life changed. Greater reserve, more ritualized speech, and an ever-present awareness that a casual joke might be reported and expanded into a case of sedition. Trust eroded slowly and inexorably. Even assassination's moral ambiguity was debated in private circles. Some argued that removing a tyrant was a service to the state. Others warned that normalized violence corroded legitimacy. Those debates rarely entered public record. They were, instead, murmured over cups of watered wine among friends who trusted one another for a few hours before returning to the necessities of caution. Yet sometimes assassination was celebrated, when it seemed to purge corruption or prevent a brutal policy. A populace that feared the emperor's cruelty could secretly rejoice at the rumor of his sudden demise. In that ambivalence lay the tragedy of the crown. It was both protector and threat. The very acts of removing a dangerous man could, in the long run, validate the methods of those who would use similar tactics for less. Shadows over the Forum, whispers of treason. The Forum Romanum, in the early hours of the day, was a place of illusion. From a distance, the marble columns caught the morning light as if the city itself had been born pure. Market stalls began their slow awakening, the smells of fresh bread and olives drifting between the structures like faint offerings to the gods. The voices of vendors carried in low, rhythmic chants, and the uneven clop of donkey hooves against the cobblestones provided the bass line to the city's waking heartbeat. But beneath the smell of honeyed pastries and the serene rhythm of commerce, there was another scent, a trace of smoke that came not from the baker's oven but from the quiet burning of loyalties. Rome was alive with whispers, and they gathered here, in the open air of the Forum, the way rain collects in the lowest stone of a courtyard. It began with small remarks. A coin pressed into the hand of a street orator who had always been loyal to the emperor, but now his speeches turned ever so slightly, weaving in pointed questions about taxes, about the worth of distant wars, about the strangers the emperor kept too close. A senator's cousin, once content to serve quietly in the grain trade, began speaking to retired generals in shaded porticos. A single word, repeated often enough, began to feel like a fact: corruption. In the Senate House itself, the air was thicker. The marble floor still gleamed, the statues of ancestors still stood sentinel, but there was a tension in the way men moved around the chamber. Every pause in conversation felt like the space after a blow has been thrown but before the body has hit the ground. Some senators made a show of aligning themselves publicly with the emperor, lavish public donations, speeches praising his vision for Rome, but privately, their letters traveled in secret pouches borne by fast horses into the countryside. And the emperor knew. He had known for weeks, perhaps months, that the rot was spreading. In the early days of his reign, Such things could be crushed before they took root, an arrest here, an exile there. But the faces now were too familiar, the names too storied. Many of them had been in his father's court. Some had stood beside him in battle. This was not the rebellion of the hungry or the ambition of unknown men. It was the slow betrayal of those who had once called him friend. At night, in the private quarters of the Palatine, he would sit with only two companions, his chief advisor, Cassian, and the captain of the Praetorian Guard, Varro. Cassian urged patience, let the dissenters reveal themselves fully, gather proof so that the purges would be clean and justified. Varro argued for speed, strike now, before the whispers turned into banners carried through the streets. You speak of proof, Varro spat one night, his voice low but hot. But proof will not save you when the forum is filled with men chanting for your head. And you speak of blood, Cassian countered, but blood will not save you when the people believe you have slaughtered their fathers without cause. The emperor said nothing for a long time, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of his chair. Outside, a storm began to roll in from the sea, the rumble of thunder weaving itself into their uneasy silence. It was not until the third night of storms that the emperor made his choice. The next morning, the forum was busier than usual. Crowds gathered to hear an announcement, though none seemed to know exactly what it would be. The Praetorian Guard stood in perfect formation, their armor glinting with rainwater, their faces unreadable. From the steps of the rostra, the emperor appeared, not in his ceremonial robes, but in the dark, simple tunic of a soldier. His voice carried without effort, not because it was loud, but because the crowd had been waiting for it. He spoke first of Rome's greatness, of the bonds between ruler and people, of the sacrifices made by all for the safety and strength of the empire. Then, slowly, he began to name names. 3 senators, 2 generals, a wealthy merchant whose fortune had bought the loyalty of more than one hungry man. He did not call them traitors outright. He said they were absent from the duties owed to the Republic, that they had placed their own desires above the harmony of Rome. And then he invited them, publicly, to clear their names before the Senate within 7 days. The reaction was immediate and split. Some in the crowd cheered, thrilled at the drama of it. Others murmured uneasily. Public challenges were dangerous things, especially when the accused held their own networks of power. In the shadows of the porticos, messengers sprinted with urgent notes, and in the upper balconies of nearby buildings, veiled women leaned forward to hear every word. That night, Rome was not quiet. Torches burned late in the courtyards of the accused. The senator's allies whispered in hurried meetings, deciding whether to appear in the Senate at all, or to flee the city under cover of darkness. In one dimly lit triclinium, the merchant Gaius Septimus sat across from 2 of the accused senators. They drank wine without tasting it, their voices low. If he thinks he can frighten us into submission, Gaius said, then he underestimates how much we have to lose. And how much we have to gain, one of the senators added. By dawn, the first messenger had already left the city, carrying a sealed scroll to a garrison 2 days' ride away, a garrison commanded by a man with little love for the emperor. For the next 6 days, the city became a theater of suspicion. Men who had been allies a week before now crossed the street to avoid speaking in public. The baths grew quieter, conversations slipping into guarded fragments. Even the markets felt different. The haggling was shorter, the laughter rarer. The emperor, meanwhile, maintained the appearance of calm. He attended the races at the Circus Maximus, presided over minor legal disputes, even walked among the people in the forum as if nothing were amiss. But the Praetorian Guard was never far from his side, and their watchful eyes missed nothing. Cassian came to him again on the 6th night. If you strike now, you will crush them, he said. If you wait for them to move first, you risk the city itself. Varro, standing in the shadows, said nothing this time. The emperor looked out over the city, its rooftops silvered by moonlight, the Tiber a dark ribbon cutting through it all. Somewhere out there, men were deciding whether they would meet him in the Senate tomorrow, or meet him on the battlefield. And in the stillness of that moment, he understood. Whichever choice they made, Rome would not be the same by the time the sun set again. The web of shadows, conspiracies in the heart of Rome. The city of Rome presented itself to the sun as if nothing had happened. Marble glinted, pigeons settled on carved cornices, and the vendors in the forum resumed their ancient music. But the parts of the city that mattered most to power were not the bright facades where citizens lounged in the light. They were the alleys beneath the arches, the narrow stairways behind shuttered windows, the cellars where rain pooled in shadow, places where paper changed hands for a coin and promises were sealed with a look. It was in those places that the Empire's real ledger was kept, written not in public decrees but in bribes, forged signatures, and the careful omission of inconvenient names. When the winter thaw gave way to a wet spring, the conspiracy that had been braided slowly through court life tightened into a knot. Varro's Reach, which some had thought merely a rumor whispered by disgruntled clerks, was revealed to be a network of astonishing intricacy. Letters with imperial seals that did not belong to him were found in warehouses. Grain convoys meant for Rome were quietly diverted along dirt roads and unloaded into private stores. Soldiers who had once reported to provincial commanders were quietly reassigned to new banners and new loyalties. The pattern was unmistakable, and the consequences were severe. A private apparatus working inside the machinery of state, rerouting wealth and influence toward a handful of men whose names never appeared on inscriptions. Lucius felt the pressure of that web like a tightening band around his chest. He went about his daily work in the scribal chamber with hands that had learned to steady themselves under stress, but at night he could not force sleep. He kept thinking of the ledger Livia and Titus had risked their lives to copy, a register of names and sums, of forged orders and paid silences, and of the way the ink had smelled when fresh, like possibility and like poison. He had seen the emperor's face the day the first rumors reached the Palatine. Practice calm, but an edge to the jaw as if a blade had been pressed there. That same expression had been reflected in the guarded eyes of Cassian and in the taut silence of Varro's captains. Livia Marcellus and Titus Flaccus had vanished into the city after their night among crates and seals. They had a copy of the ledger hidden beneath rags and inside the hollow of a small wooden statue. The original proof lay where it always lay, behind locked doors watched by blades, but what they carried could be enough. They wrote in cramped hands, in code, and passed the pages to trusted contacts. A freedman who sold fish at the forum, a washerwoman who mended the tunics of merchants, an old soldier with a limp who still owed a favor to Lucius. Each one understood risk. Each one agreed because the ledger promised more than revelation. It promised restitution to people who had watched their livelihoods evaporate into the pockets of Varro's men. Word moved in waves. In the Subura, where families lived stacked upon each other and gossip moved faster than grain, the news that someone had proof spread like a sweet-smelling pestilence. Men who had been patient began to speak out in taverns. A baker who had once quietly tolerated a tax collector's demands now muttered about justice. A young legionary, newly returned from the frontier, listened to an old man who claimed that officers had been paid to look the other way. In the spaces where Rome's underside intersected with its centers of gravity, alliances formed, fragile, combustible, and determined. At the same time, the Senate performed its ceremony of indignation. On appointed days, the elders stood beneath the porticos and debated loudly, their words polished and public, designed to take up the city's attention while the more dangerous work occurred elsewhere. Men like Marcus moved between those two worlds, appearing in the Curia with the rest, then slipping into the Subura when the Senate adjourned. He had friends and enemies there, patrons and clients. His life was a balancing act of obligations and betrayals. He had once believed in honor as a steady thing. Now he kept a hand near his dagger because honor no longer guaranteed anything. The Empress watched the unfolding from her curtained rooms with the careful temper of someone who had learned how to operate within the folds of power without exposing herself. She was not naive. She had seen favors bought and sold, but the scale stunned even her. She invited a handful of men she suspected might be amenable, generals returning from distant provinces, a provincial governor who owed her family a favor, to a small supper. Over broth and boiled fruit, she tested them with easy questions, then with well-placed contradictions, and watched how they answered. Loyalty, she found, was often a roomful of choices stated in the quiet. Some chose the emperor, others chose their heirs. Varro, for his part, remained outwardly implacable. He walked the palace as a man who knew the exact depth of each floorboard, who could tell from the faintest impression on a cushion whether a guest had shifted. He cultivated a small culture of rewards, a promotion here, a widow's pension there, little acts that bought gratitude and sealed lips. But he also sent men into the night when necessary, men whose loyalty was not sentimental and whose methods were efficient. To persuade the city to be quiet, he could make an example, swift, surgical, and terrifying. Livia and Titus chose their allies with care. They handed fragments of the ledger to those whose survival depended on its revelations. A warehouseman whose business had been quietly starved, a cohort commander who had not been paid arrears, the mother of a conscript who had died inexplicably at a training ground. Each exchange had to be made in the right place, through the right intermediary, because a misstep could leave them hanging naked in the wind to be picked apart by Varro's hawks. But conspiracies breed counter-conspiracies. Varro had spies of his own, men who liked the feel of power more than the pursuits of loyalty. One of them was a freedman named Rufus, who had once worked in the scribal rooms and still had hours to waste with men who drank too much wine in the taverns off the forum. Rufus had a taste for gossip and a worse taste for profit. When Livia's name was mentioned carelessly in a tavern by a man who had been promised a coin to keep silent, Rufus heard more than rumor. He traced a line. It is in the nature of such networks that a careless word can be a fuse. The moment of unraveling came not from a grand stroke, but from a small, human thing: impatience. Titus, old enough to know better but young enough to be driven by the desire to see justice before he died, sent a messenger too quickly to a consul he believed sympathetic. The courier was stopped at the gates of the consul's domus by men who had been tipped by a servant who liked a silver coin. The messenger's hands were searched. The pages were uncovered. The handwriting was unfamiliar to those who found it, but the names on the ledger were familiar to everyone. Rufus saw the documents and understood their value. He took a copy and sold it, first to a trader, then to Varro. Varro's reaction was not a fury made of mere temper. It was architecture. He did not want a public spectacle that would inflame the city. He wanted to dismantle the circle quietly, to choke the flow of trust that allowed such documents to circulate. He started by isolating names. Petitions were quietly filed. A low-level official who was listed as having allowed a diversion of grain was summoned on a pretext and shipped to a distant province. A steward was accused of failing to pay debts. His house was seized. In each case, Varro used existing laws and reputations to make the removals seem like legal rectifications rather than a purge. The policy was simple: break the network where it touched flesh. But the ledger had been seen by too many for Varro to remove all of them at once without risk. He needed a broader strategy. So he staged a small play, a public trial of one of the conspirators, a man of middling rank named Lucanus, accused of colluding with foreign traders. The trial was loud and public, designed to answer the city's hunger for scandal. Lucanus was found guilty by a predictable chorus of senators who had their own reasons for wanting a scapegoat. His execution was made public and theatrical. The effect was twofold. It satisfied the gullible fury of the streets and sent a message to those inside the webs: if you whispered, you could be made an example. At the same time, Varro began to plant evidence that would discredit the ledger itself. He had a network of counterfeiters and forgers who produced papers so plausible that even trained eyes could be fooled. A forged note with Livia's name, apparently implicating her in a separate, less noble scheme, found its way into a magistrate's hands. His credibility, and later the credibility of her entire circle, took a blow. Mistrust is the true currency of such wars. Once it circulates, truth collides with opinion and loses its shape. Lucius watched these developments in a state that felt like walking through quicksilver. He knew how fragile the ledger's provenance was. Even true facts could be made to look false under the deliberate hand of a skilled man. He began to copy, as he had done before, but now the copying was a moral act as much as an administrative one. He made duplicates of certain entries and hid them in places presumed safe: the lining of a pilgrim's cloak, the hollow of a teacher's writing tablet, the seam of a stone dedicated to the household gods. He told himself this was preservation, that someday the truth would out and those archives would be needed to call a reckoning. But he also understood that by moving facts he made himself complicit and a target. The city, for its part, cried out for heroes and for simple explanations. At market corners men argued for purges. At the baths, others spoke of the need for reform. The Empress, seeing the danger of an unmoored public fury, ordered games and spectacles to distract. Chariots thundered, gladiators spilled blood for coin, and the people cheered. It was not that spectacle soothed. It was that spectacle reshaped attention. But even the largest crowd cannot blot out a ledger that names people who control grain, arms, and roads. Hunger is patient. Rumor is patient. The ledger's consequences crept like mildew into the structure of daily life. The conspirators attempted countermeasures. Livia arranged an audience with 2 sympathetic senators. They swore, ogging their hands over their breasts, to press the Senate to investigate the treasury. Titus drafted petitions and sent them with careful patterns of wax to magistrates known for integrity. Marcus, who had been circling the problem like a wary bird, the Emperor's Gambit, reckoning and ruin. The first light of dawn spilled reluctantly over the ancient city of Rome, casting long, uneven shadows that stretched across the marble pillars of the Forum and over the sprawling rooftops of the Palatine Hill. Despite the calm, the air was charged with a tension so thick it felt almost tangible, like a storm waiting silently to break. The city, a complex tapestry of wealth, power, ambition, and ancient tradition, braced itself for what was to come. the imperial inquiry into the web of corruption and treachery that had shaken the foundations of the empire. For weeks, whispers had floated through the streets, carried by merchants, slaves, soldiers, and senators alike. News of the ledger, with its damning entries of bribery, forged documents, and stolen gold, had seeped into every corner. The emperor's decision to hold a public inquiry was met with a mix of hope and fear. Hope that justice would finally pierce the veil of secrecy. Fear that the revelations could unravel the fragile peace that held the empire together. In the heart of the city, the Senate House was transformed into an arena of intrigue and accusation. Senators arrived draped in their white togas, their faces masks of solemnity and calculation. Many had ties to Varro's network, some complicit, others frightened by what the ledger might reveal. Among them, some had already begun to distance themselves, cautious to avoid the shadow of disgrace. Yet all were compelled by the spectacle that was about to unfold. The emperor, seated upon his elevated throne, commanded the room with a gaze that swept through the gathered men like a tempest. His expression was unreadable, a blend of authority, weariness, and an inscrutable resolve. Beside him sat the empress, equally composed, her eyes reflecting the burden of power and the fragile nature of the empire's peace. Lucius, stationed among the scribes, felt the weight of history upon him. The ledger, safely tucked within his robes, was both a weapon and a curse. It held the power to topple men and perhaps even alter the course of Rome's destiny. Every word spoken within these walls could ignite a chain reaction that no one might fully control. As the inquiry began, the courtroom atmosphere thickened with tension. Witnesses were called, some truthful, others coached or intimidated. The ledger was presented, and its contents read aloud in meticulous detail. Names long respected were dragged into the light. Alliances were exposed as betrayals. The system of bribery, coercion, and manipulation was laid bare. Senators shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered hurried prayers. Others clenched fists beneath their benches. Varro, seated among the accused, remained outwardly calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. His defense was practiced. He denied all allegations, casting doubt on the ledger's authenticity and accusing the accusers of conspiracy. His eloquence swayed some, but the weight of evidence was undeniable. Even some of his stanchest allies began to distance themselves, fearing the emperor's wrath and the public's fury. Outside the Senate, Rome's streets were alive with anticipation. Markets emptied earlier than usual, taverns filled with hushed conversations. Children paused in their play as rumors rippled through the city. The people, ever hungry for justice and spectacle, awaited the outcome with bated breath. The games in the Colosseum that evening would be more than mere entertainment. They would be a barometer of the city's mood. Back within the Senate, the inquiry took a sharp turn when a previously silent senator, a man known for his loyalty to the emperor, stood to deliver a devastating accusation. He claimed to have evidence of Varro's direct involvement in a plot to undermine imperial authority, not merely through corruption, but through schemes of assassination and sedition. The chamber erupted into chaos. Senators shouted, called for order, and demanded proof. The senator produced letters, intercepted and verified by trusted officials, that revealed secret communications between Varro and foreign powers hostile to Rome. The letters detailed plans to destabilize the emperor's rule, orchestrate revolts in distant provinces, and redirect imperial funds to finance mercenaries. The conspiracy was not merely political, it was treason. The emperor, his eyes narrowing, nodded slowly. The game had changed. He ordered the immediate arrest of Varro and several key associates. Guards swept through the Senate chamber, detaining those named in the letters. Some resisted, others collapsed in stunned silence. The emperor's voice rang out, declaring that justice would be swift and uncompromising. In the days that followed, the city was gripped by a mix of fear and hope. Public trials were held, their proceedings both spectacle and solemnity. Varro's fall from grace was dramatic. A man who had wielded immense power now shackled and paraded before the people. His associates faced similar fates: exile, confiscation of wealth, or execution. The emperor's message was clear: corruption would not be tolerated, and the empire's integrity must be preserved at all costs. Yet, beneath the surface, new tensions simmered. The purge created a power vacuum that rival factions rushed to fill. Senators who had played both sides now positioned themselves as reformers. Generals eyed opportunities to extend their influence. The emperor's control was strong, but the web of alliances and enmities that defined Rome's politics was ever-changing. Livia and Titus, though no longer fugitives, remained cautious. Their role in exposing the conspiracy had earned them gratitude and suspicion in equal measure. They moved carefully through the city's social circles, aware that enemies lurked behind every smile and invitation. The ledger, now a symbol of both justice and danger, was locked away in a secure vault, its pages a reminder of the fragile balance between truth and power. Lucius, reflecting on the events, understood that Rome's story was far from over. The empire had survived this crisis, but the shadows would always linger. The emperor's Gambit had won the battle, but the war for Rome's soul was eternal. A delicate dance of ambition, loyalty, and survival played out on a stage as grand and perilous as the city itself. As the sun set once more over Rome, casting golden hues across its ancient stones, the city breathed deeply, a momentary pause between storms. The crowns worn by emperors might gleam with gold and jewels, but they bore the weight of secrets, sacrifices, and the ceaseless struggle for power that defined an empire. The legacy of the crown, endings and echoes. The city of Rome, with its sprawling forums and towering temples, had endured countless upheavals, but none quite like the one that had just passed through its marble veins like a fever. The reckoning of corruption and conspiracy left scars that were invisible to the casual observer but indelibly etched in the fabric of the empire's political heart. The emperor, having survived the storm, sat once more upon his throne, aware that victory in Rome was never absolute. It was a fragile balance held precariously by power, perception, and the whispers of history. Months had passed since the final arrests and trials. The city had settled into a wary calm, but beneath the surface, the echoes of betrayal and ambition resonated still. Senators returned to their debates with more caution, generals watched their backs as much as the enemy, and the common people resumed their daily routines, their trust in power forever altered. Rome's ancient spirit endured, but the crown worn by its rulers now seemed heavier, its glitter dimmed by the knowledge of the shadows beneath. Livia and Titus, once fugitives and now cautious influencers, moved through this changed world with a new purpose. The ledger that had sparked the upheaval was no longer a mere document of accusations. It had become a symbol of truth, resistance, and the cost of power. They worked quietly, advocating for reforms in the Senate, urging for greater transparency in the handling of the empire's wealth. Their efforts were met with resistance, of course, but also with small victories, seeds of change planted in a soil long tilled by intrigue. Lucius, the humble scribe who had risked everything to preserve the ledger's truth, found himself at a crossroads. The shadow of his actions loomed large, a constant reminder of the delicate dance between duty and danger. His copies of the ledger, hidden away in the homes of trusted allies, ensured that the story could not be easily erased. He had become a guardian of memory, aware that history was as much about what was remembered as what was forgotten. The emperor, for his part, understood that the crown he wore was not merely a symbol of authority but a burden of legacy. He initiated new laws aimed at curbing the excesses of provincial governors and tightening the oversight of grain shipments and military levies. But he also knew that such reforms could only go so far. The true challenge was the human one, the ambitions, fears, and loyalties that shaped every decision in Rome's labyrinthine corridors of power. The city itself seemed to hold its breath for a time, caught between an old world and a new. Festivals resumed, with gladiators fighting and chariots racing beneath the cheers of the populace. But in the quieter moments, beneath the laughter and spectacle, a new awareness had settled, that Rome's greatness was inseparable from its fragility, and that every crown bore the weight of stories untold, of sacrifices hidden in shadow. As the sun dipped below the horizon on a cool autumn evening, the emperor summoned his closest council. They gathered in a chamber adorned with frescoes depicting Rome's founding myths, the great heroes who had shaped its destiny. The conversation was solemn, reflecting on the lessons learned and the path ahead. They spoke of vigilance, of the need to guard not just the empire's borders but the integrity of its institutions. Meanwhile, whispers of new conspiracies began to surface, a reminder that the cycle of ambition and power was unending. Some spoke of senators plotting to undermine the emperor's heirs, others of generals seeking to carve their own fiefdoms from distant provinces. Rome's story was a living one, written by those who dared to seize the moment and shaped by those who survived its unforgiving tides. Livia, Titus, and Lucius, each in their own way, had become part of that story, figures who bridged the gap between shadow and light, between silence and revelation. Their courage and sacrifice had altered the course of the empire, but they knew that history would judge them not by their deeds alone, but by the legacy they left behind. And so, the crown of Rome continued to gleam, a symbol of power, a beacon of ambition, and a reminder that beneath every gilded surface lies a web of secrets waiting to be unraveled. Hey friends, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden corridors of power in ancient Rome. Tonight, we didn't just walk the marble halls of emperors. We lived their struggles, their fears, and the shadows they could not escape. If you enjoyed this slow, immersive story that brings the echoes of history to life, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It means the world to me and helps us all keep wandering through these forgotten tales together. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. Share that in the comments below. It's incredible how many of us, across continents and time zones, are connected by our shared curiosity and the quiet hum of history. Now, as you let the story settle in your mind, dim the lights, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift. Let the whispers of Rome's past lull you into a peaceful rest, knowing that history, with all its light and shadow, lives on in each of us. Until next time, sleep well, and may the secrets of the past guide your dreams.